January 1945. A telephone rings in a secluded hunting lodge deep in Germany's Harz Mountains. The man who lifts the receiver is Major General Adolf Galland, once the youngest general in the Wehrmacht and the commanding officer of all Luftwaffe fighter units. Now, he's under house arrest, grounded, stripped of authority, forbidden to fly, and waiting, perhaps, for a firing squad. His crime? Telling Hermann Göring the truth. The voice on the line is brisk, official. The Fuhrer wishes to speak with you. A click, then another voice, one Galland knows instantly. Adolf Hitler. Galland, I'm giving you a final chance. Form a squadron. Choose whoever you wish. Take the jets. Show me what's possible. Galland's grip tightens around the receiver. Outside, snow drifts against the windows. Somewhere beyond that gray sky, the Luftwaffe he helped build is being annihilated. American fighters swarm across Germany like locusts. His aces, the finest pilots on Earth, are dying at a rate of 50 a day. And now, with Germany collapsing, with the war all but lost, Hitler wants him to create a new squadron using the Me-262, the jet fighter that should have been operational 3 years earlier. Göring closes his eyes. He knows the truth. This will not change the outcome. It's far too late for that. Yet he also knows this is a chance to prove what might have been, to show the world what Germany could have achieved if Hitler and Göring had listened to their pilots instead of their own delusions. I accept, Galland says quietly. He hangs up the phone and begins writing a list of names. Within weeks, he will assemble the most elite fighter unit in aviation history, 10 holders of the Knight's Cross, men with hundreds of aerial victories among them, flying the world's first operational jet. For 3 brief months, they will terrorize Allied bomber crews before the war ends. This is the story of JV-44, the Squadron of Aces, the story of how the world's most skilled fighter pilots, flying the most advanced aircraft of the Second World War, arrive exactly 3 years too late to make a difference. It's a tale of technical genius rendered meaningless by industrial collapse, and of the bitter lesson Galland and his men learned. In modern war, timing isn't everything. It's the only thing. To understand why Hitler's call shocked Galland, one must look at the months before. By late 1944, Galland was the most decorated fighter pilot in the Luftwaffe. He'd fought since the Spanish Civil War, survived the Battle of Britain, and commanded the fighter arm through years of slaughter over Germany. He wore the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, one of only 27 men ever to do so. And he was about to risk it all. In November 1944, Göring summoned his fighter commanders to explain why the Luftwaffe was failing to stop American daylight raids. But instead of listening, Göring spent a meeting accusing them of cowardice. Galland had had enough. For months he presented hard facts. The Americans are producing 1,000 fighters a month. Germany couldn't replace its losses. Fuel was running out. Its veteran pilots were dead. And the Me-262s that might have changed everything. Hitler had ordered them converted into bombers. Göring dismissed it all as defeatism, questioning their loyalty and courage. Galland stood, reached for the medal around his neck, and tore it off that eye in front of every officer in the room. He threw the Knight's Cross onto Göring's desk. Silence. Göring stared at the medal, then at Galland. His face flushed purple with rage. But he said nothing. He couldn't. Galland was too famous, too respected by the fighter corps. Executing him would have caused open rebellion among Luftwaffe pilots. Instead, Göring chose something worse. He stripped Galland of his command and placed him under house arrest. The man who had built and led the Luftwaffe fighter arm would spend the final months of the war isolated in a hunting lodge, listening to radio reports of his men dying while the Me-262 jets he'd fought so hard to deploy sat grounded, victims of Hitler's obsession with turning them into bombers. And that was where Hitler's phone call found him, disgraced, powerless, furious. Yet the Führer's sudden offer changed everything. For reasons never entirely clear, perhaps desperation, Hitler reversed course. He would allow Galland to form a jet fighter unit, choose his own pilots, and operate independently. It was, in effect, an admission that Galland had been right all along. But it came far, far too late. Galland didn't hesitate. He picked up the telephone and began calling Germany's best surviving fighter pilots. His pitch was brutally honest. The war is lost. We all know it. But I'm forming a squadron with the Me-262. We won't change the end, but we'll prove what could have been, and we'll do it flying the future. The response stunned him. Every single pilot said yes, immediately. These weren't naive young men chasing glory. They were veterans, scarred and exhausted, who'd watched their comrades die by the hundreds. They knew Germany was finished, knew this squadron was symbolic, not strategic. They knew they might not survive. And still, they came. Gerhard Barkhorn arrived first. 301 victories, the second highest scoring ace in history. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes sunken from years of non-stop combat. Shot down 9 times, wounded 3. He should have been in a hospital, not in a cockpit. "I'm done flying piston engines against impossible odds," he told Galland. "Let me fly a jet. Let me feel what air combat was meant to be." Next came Heinz Bahr, 220 victories. Then Walter Krupinski, 197. Then Johannes Steinhoff, 176. His face still wrapped in bandages from burns suffered when his previous aircraft crashed on takeoff. Within 2 weeks, Galland had assembled 10 pilots, all holders of the Knight's Cross, with more than 1,500 confirmed victories among them. The average man in the unit was an ace 10 times over. They called themselves JV-44, Jagdverband 44, Fighter Wing 44. Everyone else simply called them what they were, the Squadron of Aces. Their base was established at Munich-Riem, a half-finished airfield near the Bavarian capital. Conditions were primitive. Barracks were converted hangars. The runway was cratered from bombing raids and had to be patched before every mission. Allied fighters strafed the field daily. And the jets? There weren't enough. Galland had asked for 30 Me-262s. He received 16. On any given day, only 7 were operational. But when those 7 roared down the runway, twin turbojets screaming, their exhaust shimmering like liquid fire, they embodied something extraordinary, the final perfection of the fighter pilot's craft, arriving precisely when it no longer mattered. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was everything Galland had dreamed of and more. Powered by 2 Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines slung beneath its wings, each producing 1,980 pounds of thrust, it could reach 540 miles per hour, a full 100 miles per hour faster than the best Allied piston fighters. But speed was only part of its brilliance. The Me-262 could climb to 30,000 feet in under 7 minutes. The vaunted P-51 Mustang needed 12. At high altitude, where the bombers flew, the Me-262 could accelerate away from Allied escorts with effortless contempt. American pilots would open fire, only to watch in disbelief as a German jet simply pulled ahead, .50 caliber tracers arcing uselessly into empty sky. And then there was its armament. The Me-262 carried 4 108 Malawian Quachas 30mm autocannons mounted in the nose, each capable of firing 650 rounds per minute. A single 30mm shell could rip a 2-foot hole through an aircraft frame. 3 or 4 hits would tear a B-17 apart entirely. Traditional fighter doctrine called for long, sustained bursts. The Me-262 needed only 1 second of fire, 1 squeeze of the trigger, and a bomber ceased to exist. Galland led the first combat mission himself in late February 1945. He'd been flying fighters for over a decade, yet nothing had prepared him for the experience of piloting the Me-262. It was like being shot out of a cannon, he said later. The acceleration slammed him against the seat. Within seconds, he was past 400 miles per hour. Every piston aircraft he'd ever flown now felt primitive, as if he'd been driving a car all his life and suddenly found himself in a rocket. He climbed to 25,000 feet and intercepted a formation of B-17s over Munich, escorted by P-51 Mustangs. The Americans saw him coming and turned to engage. Galland merely pushed both throttles forward. The Me-262 surged ahead, leaving the escorts behind. He maneuvered 1,000 yards in front of the bomber formation, rolled inverted, and came back head-on. Closing speed, over 600 miles per hour. He had perhaps 2 seconds before they passed. When the lead bomber filled his gun sight, Galland fired. The 30mm cannons thundered, for streams of shells converging on the B-17's nose. Sparks danced across the fuselage. The right wing folded upward and tore free. The bomber disintegrated as it fell. The entire engagement lasted 4 seconds. By the time the P-51s reacted, Galland was already 3 miles away. Climbing back through the clouds, untouchable, he landed at Munich-Riem an hour later, taxied to his hangar, and cut the engines. The ground crew erupted in cheers. His wingman, Backhorn, landed moments later and climbed from his cockpit, grinning for the first time in months. This, Backhorn said, is what we should have had in 1942. And there lay the tragedy, because he was absolutely right. For exactly 3 months, JV-44 was the most feared fighter unit in the European theater. Allied bomber crews learned to dread the thin white contrails of approaching Me-262s. The jets appeared out of nowhere, made a single devastating pass, and vanished before escorts could react. In March alone, the squadron destroyed 50 Allied aircraft. The kill-to-loss ratio was astonishing, nearly 5-1. But Göring knew the only numbers that truly mattered, and those painted a different picture. Germany had built roughly 1,400 Me-262s during the war. Of those, only 300 were operational fighters. The rest were bombers, trainers, or wrecked in Allied raids. Meanwhile, the Americans were producing over 1,000 fighters every month. Combined B-17 and B-24 output exceeded 500 bombers per month, and Britain added hundreds more Lancasters and Mosquitoes. Göring did the math. Even if every Me-262 destroyed 5 Allied aircraft, an impossible rate, they would barely dent the bomber offensive. The Allies could absorb those losses and keep coming. Then came the fuel crisis. The Me-262's turbojets devoured fuel, 5 times out of piston engines. Galland's squadron needed 10,000 liters of jet fuel per sortie. By April 1945, Germany's synthetic fuel plants were smoking ruins. The fuel simply didn't exist. And the cruelest irony of all, the jet's vulnerability during takeoff and landing. The Me-262's engines were temperamental, requiring several minutes to spool up to full power. During that time, the jet was slower than any conventional fighter, utterly defenseless. The Allied commanders figured this out almost immediately. They stopped chasing Me-262s in the sky. Instead, they stationed patrols near known jet bases and struck during takeoff and landing. JV-44 lost more pilots on their own runways than in actual combat. Göring watched it happen again and again. An ace with 100 victories would lift off, turbojet screaming, and before the Me-262 could gather speed, a waiting P-51 Mustang would pounce. The jet would cartwheel across the field in a bowl of fire. It was death by arithmetic, the same arithmetic that had doomed Germany from the beginning. Quality didn't matter when you were drowning in quantity, and timing didn't matter when you were 3 years too late. Göring tried to push such thoughts aside. He focused on the missions, on proving what his men could do, on writing one final, defiant chapter in the Luftwaffe story. But in the quiet moments, alone in his quarters, he would scribble numbers on scrap paper. What if the Me-262 had entered combat in 1942? Before America's industry was fully mobilized, when the RAF bomber offensive was still small, the math was devastating. With a 2-year head start, Germany could have built 5,000 Me-262s by 1944. That would have meant complete air superiority over Europe. The Allied bombing campaign might never have succeeded. The invasion of France might have failed. The entire war could have unfolded differently. Instead, the Me-262 arrived in 1945, when there was no fuel, when the factories were rubble, when Germany's best pilots were dead, and when the war itself was already lost. JV-44 became a proof of concept, nothing more, a demonstration of what might have been. And Adolf Galland, Germany's youngest general and greatest tactician, found himself commanding a squadron that existed only to illustrate how completely Hitler and Göring had failed. April 26, 1945, 2 weeks before Germany's surrender. Göring stood on the runway at Munich-Riem as dawn broke over the Alps. American forces were less than 30 miles away. Russian troops were even closer. The airfield shook under constant artillery fire. Half the runway was cratered and useless. He had 7 operational Me-262s, just enough for one last mission. Intelligence reported a formation of American B-26 Marauders approaching Munich. The raid meant nothing now. The city was already rubble. But Göring didn't care about strategy anymore. He cared about his men, about finishing on his own terms, going down fighting. He climbed into his personal Me-262, the one marked Red 13 in bright paint on the nose. His crew chief, a teenage boy named Klaus, who should have been in school, Help strap him in, sir. Klaus said quietly. You don't have to do this. The war is over. Galland smiled. That's exactly why I have to. The turbojet spooled up with a high-pitched scream. Blue flame flickered from the exhausts. Galland released the brakes. The Me-262 leapt forward and soared into the morning sky. Within seconds, he was climbing hard, his wingman close behind. They found the B-26 formation over the Danube, 12 bombers flying in tight formation, P-51 escorts circling above. Galland didn't hesitate. He rolled inverted and dove, building speed, then rolled upright and came in head-on. The closing speed was insane. He had barely a second. He centered the lead bomber in his gun sight and fired. The 30mm cannon shook the A-frame. The bomber's nose exploded in a flash. Then he was past, pulling up sharply, G-forces crushing him into the seat. Behind him, the B-26 fell away in flames. But the P-51 escorts had been waiting. For a dive from above, cutting off his escape route. Galland jinked. Left, then right, but one of the Mustangs slipped in behind him and opened fire. Galland felt the impacts, heard metal shriek and tear. The right engine flamed out, then the left. The jet was dead, a 17,000-pound glider with no power. He forced the nose down, trading altitude for time, scanning desperately for somewhere, anywhere, to land. Below, he spotted a bomb crater, maybe 50 feet across, gouged into the earth by an American raid weeks earlier. He aimed for it. The Me-262 slammed down hard, too hard. The landing gear folded instantly. The jet skidded across the torn ground, shedding panels and debris until it struck the crater wall and stopped dead. For a moment, Galland didn't move. He tasted blood. His knee was shattered, the bone visible through his torn flight suit. But he was alive. Above, his wingmen circled, saw him climb from the wreckage, saw him wave them away. They rocked their wings in farewell and headed back to base. Galland sat on the rim of the crater, staring at the twisted wreck of his jet, the machine that should have been Germany's salvation, that had arrived 3 years too late to matter. 2 weeks later, Germany surrendered. JV-44's final record. Roughly 50 confirmed victories in 3 months of combat. 27 pilots lost, most killed on takeoff or landing. 7 Me-262s destroyed, not by enemy fighters but by lack of fuel and spare parts. Adolf Galland survived. His shattered knee never healed. He walked with a cane for the rest of his life. But he lived another 51 years, long enough to watch jet fighters become standard in every air force, long enough to befriend the very American and British pilots he once fought, long enough to see the Me-262 displayed in museums as a brilliant design that came too late to save a nation that built it. When historians later asked him about JV-44, about those final desperate months commanding the world's first jet squadron, his answer never changed. We proved what was possible. We showed what German engineering could achieve. But we also proved something else, that in modern war, timing is everything. The Me-262 in 1945 was a masterpiece. In 1942, it would have been a war winner. That 3-year gap decided everything. The Me-262's legacy far outlived the Third Reich. Every jet fighter that followed, from the F-86 Sabre to the MiG-15, from the Phantom to the modern F-35, owes part of its lineage to that swept-wing German jet. But the deeper lesson of JV-44 had nothing to do with aerodynamics. It was about the cold arithmetic of industrial war. Germany's finest engineers built the Me-262. Its best pilots flew it. Its sharpest tacticians employed it. And none of it mattered, because Germany lacked the factories to produce it in quantity and the fuel to keep it flying. Galland understood this better than anyone. After the war, when American interrogators asked what might have changed the outcome, he didn't speak of courage or tactics. He spoke of timing and production. If we'd had operational Me-262s in 1942, he told them, the Allied bombing campaign would have failed. Your losses would have been unsustainable. You would have been forced to negotiate. But by 1945, you were building 1,000 fighters a month to our 100. You had fuel. We had none. You could lose 10 planes for every one of ours and still win. And you did. The interviewer pressed him. So the Me-262 didn't matter. Galland smiled sadly. Oh, it mattered. It proved the future of air combat. But it also proved something else, that genius arriving too late is indistinguishable from failure. JV-44 flew for exactly 91 days. In that time, they destroyed more Allied aircraft per pilot than any other Luftwaffe unit. They proved beyond doubt the viability of jet fighters. They demonstrated what German aviation could have achieved with earlier vision and better leadership. But they changed nothing. The war ended exactly as it was destined to end. The Squadron of Aces was spectacle, not strategy, a final demonstration of what might have been, staged at the very moment it could no longer matter. And that, perhaps, is the true story of JV-44. Not what they did, but what they symbolized, the final proof that in modern war, skill and technology mean nothing against overwhelming industry and lost time. Adolf Galland lived to see the jet age he had helped create. He died in 1996, at 83, surrounded by the Allied pilots who had once been his enemies. His legacy wasn't in medals or victories, but in the truth he carried for half a century. In war, timing isn't everything. It's the only thing.